So welcome back from our break. For those of you who may not have been here this morning, I'm Thomas Lewis, or Tal, from the Department of Religious Studies and also an Associate Dean in the Graduate School. I want to begin just by saying thank you again to all of our presenters, particularly for our graduate students who presented, but also for all of the questions from the group. This has really been a fantastic set of conversations so far. This is something we've been looking forward to for quite some time, and it's been fantastic to see it come together. I'm delighted to then have this opportunity for a broader roundtable discussion among the panelists, and I particularly want to invite the proctors to continue contributing over the course of the conversation. We have a great group of people who are not generally at a loss for words, so I will plan to be brief. I thought I would start by perhaps flagging three general areas or broad questions or motifs that I saw emerging across a number of the talks. And I suggest these as an invitation in case our speakers would like to comment on one or more of them. But I also really want to make sure that you have the opportunity to engage as you want, perhaps with each other's conversation so far. The first of the themes I would note that has been prominent from the first session this morning through the last has been various notions of publics. I think we've used the word in a variety of ways, talking about the importance and value of particular kinds of projects that engage local communities, other notions of the public that are by no means local, as we think about Twitter, for instance. But also, particularly in the last session, some interesting concerns being raised in multiple ways about a pressure to be public and the kinds of vulnerability that that may raise. I think certain of the conversations really made me wonder whether we're seeing a kind of fading of what we might think of historically as a division between public humanities and the other part of humanities, and that boundary might be fading. I would be interested to hear if people have more thoughts on that. And I think there are also real questions that emerge as we emphasize those public, community-related, in some cases, dimensions of the work, what that means for a variety of disciplines across the humanities, perhaps those that engage historical communities that may not be present in the same way today. So, publics. A second issue that is a very broad issue, but I thought our two proctors thinking about English and the work that they've been doing talked about things like a series of workshops that are being built. And I had this image of a scaffolding that is being built to support students in a variety of possible career pathways. So I'm interested both in that scaffolding, but also in what it is that the scaffolding is being built around. That is, how are we transforming the topic studied, what our courses themselves look like. And I want to note, this was one of the areas where I saw arguably real divergences in some of the notions expressed. I think of Catherine Lofton talking about one of the areas where they had consensus in moving forward the report at Yale was decreasing the number of courses required. A casual conversation with a colleague here suggested, I'm not sure we would get consensus on that in many departments at Brown. And then Chris's talking about going to perhaps 4 years of coursework for some of the students. So I don't know if there are a range of issues there that people might want to take up. And lastly, we've talked a lot about change, a lot about pressure from the outside to change, and perhaps the importance of resisting some of that pressure, but also resistance to change from within. So change and resistance to change. And I'm certainly thinking about the relative and roles of faculty, of students, and of administrators in bringing about some of those kinds of changes, because I think those have all been circulating, and I'd be delighted to hear some of our panelists reflect further and more explicitly on that. So with that, let me turn things over to you, and I'll give each of the panelists an opportunity to speak if you would like at the beginning, and then turn things over to questions from the audience. We have an hour, which is not that long, so we may want to try to keep things moving so we get to hear from a number of people. George? Yeah.
I'll start on the first issue, which is on the publics. For those of you that may not know this organization, one of my training grounds in thinking about the publics comes from Imagining America, Artists, Scholars in Public Life. They have done this at the intersection of the academy and the larger public for a long time. Started at the University of Michigan, went to Syracuse University, and now they're located at UC Davis. But they essentially work with faculty primarily in the humanities and in the arts that have a commitment to specific communities for a long time, i.e. they're looking not at one class or one research project, but actually people who will consistently work with a community over a very long period of time. And those are the folks that they really engage with. One of the first ways I got involved with them was through something called the Tenure Team Initiative, which was to ask really that question that came up, which was how do you judge at the tenure case that public work? And one of the things that they developed was a whole notion of doing that in a portfolio system, which is used in some disciplines at the university, architecture, that sort of thing, in terms of putting together the work that you do and having people look at that, but also having it judged by people who are not necessarily academics, so that they're looking at that. And again, this isn't across the board, but for people who say that they in fact are public scholars, it's a way that the university can incorporate that kind of evaluation in that work. I think this is all important. Now, the fundamental start of that conversation comes from the histories of ethnic studies, and when it confronts the university, and ethnic studies comes from outside and basically scholars doing community work. Whether we're talking about Du Bois and his kind of being pushed aside in terms of predominantly white universities, but the incredible work he did in Philadelphia and Atlanta and a whole bunch of different places, whether that comes from someone like Carrie McWilliams. I mean, I could go on and on about the people within the context of ethnic studies who were committed to public work. There's always been that, but it's largely been outside of predominantly white universities. When ethnic studies started to come into play in the 1970s, many people, the universities didn't know what to do with that kind of commitment. And so now people, and again, this is a pushing that I've made, they will trace it back to John Dewey, public work. But in fact, there's always been scholars of color who have done public work of substance that have bridged that line. So in that Tenure Team Initiative, one of the most basic things that Imagining America did was it asked scholars, how did you present your public work to tenure? And it's amazing what came out. People like Earl Lewis, who we mentioned because he was president of the Mellon Foundation, talked specifically about hiding it. Because at the time he came up for tenure, I believe it was in the 1980s, history departments would have judged it critically, right? Would have said, wait, that's not real scholarship. So he literally took that public work off of his CV. And that's what a lot of ethnic scholars did in the 80s and 90s, is that they basically, though they had done it and that it was a consistent part of their life, they would never put it on their promotion cases because they felt that their departments and their universities would strike it against them for having done that work. So I think it's really important to have to know that this is something that has been affecting universities for a very, very long time. Who the public is it simply people who get to write for the Atlantic or the New York Times? Or is there something else to public work? What does it mean to be engaged with people who are now K through 12 teachers, which is the way I came up, basically, in terms of doing that consistently as an assistant professor. How do we judge what that work is and how it will be valued? Imagining America calls it public scholarship, and that there has to be ways to evaluate it effectively so that if it's going to be part of an assessment, and again, not for everyone, for those that feel like it's fundamental to the kind of work that they do, it should be evaluated fairly and concretely at every promotion. The UC system is interesting in this way because I am one that actually, whatever the problems might be in evaluating it for tenure, Evaluating it for full professors is absolutely critical if the notion for full professors is that you're going to be judging impact, right? Not just in the field, but you're going to judge impact. In the UC system, it's very explicit. You're supposed to have an impact in the wider world to become a full professor. Well, then, judging public scholarship is absolutely critical. So I don't think this is a new area. It's a very old area in many ways for the universities, but not one that we've done particularly well.
I really agree with that. I really want to say that the thing I have found most frustrating to try to figure out is how to talk about the question of impact in the evaluation of tenure and promotion. I think that's a word we could spend a lot more time today on. I want to begin just two final comments. First of all, I just really want to thank Eleanor, Emily, and Zuri and Elaine for your answer to my questions. I really felt really soothed. And why? You know, it's a word that's really hard to use lightly because it means something actually very difficult to do, which is solidarity. Difference is the thing to keep an eye out for. I feel so completely inspired today by witnessing Relina's talk. But if we're going to fight for these institutions, which we know are crummy, failed, sinful, we have to do a better job of naming where we can actually agree and be in solidarity and fight against the powers that are most problematic in our institutions. And we can maybe pile those up so we can walk out today and agree on where's the worst evil being coming upon us. It turns out it's not that we don't want to be nerdy. It's not that we don't want to be inconsequential. We actually all pretty much believe that inconsequence is one of the ways to knowledge, that there's something about, not instrumentalization in a simple sense. I really learned from what George said about that. But I'm interested in areas that right now don't make sense in public light, but might connect to work and answer problems. We're in such a gorgeous fluorescence of Black studies. If you said that in 1992, no one would believe you. No one would believe you where we are right now. You get laughed out of the room. And so how do we talk about areas that could rise forward and be the space of political and intellectual transformation? How do you seed and nurture those while recognizing that our students' future economic prospects are on the line of our investment in them? So I think I just want to close with real gratitude to the language of what it is to imagine a field as never a narrowness. Thought, especially in the humanities, trips out. Disciplines are sectarian conjures, not real limits. And the fact that the public is not as easy a place to imagine entering with our forms of knowledge, and to do so with caution and protection for the strange people we all are to have chosen these institutions as our temporary or permanent asylum.
Are we going down the line? Should I go next? Yep. I mean, that was so beautiful. Like, that was gorgeous. I'm not going to be nearly as eloquent. And I think that my big revelation today, which Jean said, no duh, quote unquote too, that I'll share with you all, is that I think that our anxiety about the humanities is really an anxiety over whiteness and straightness and cisness and ableness, right? Because the ways in which we're seeing that George and I keep kind of stubbornly pointing out, this growth in our fields is not replicated everywhere. And I think that we just need to grapple with that some more as we're thinking about what actually humanities centers need to be doing, which I think a lot of our humanities centers are doing. Those of us who are advising places like the Mellon and thinking about what is the reconstitution of the university look like to actually have loss in areas, right? That's what giving up privilege is about, is realizing, actually, it's time for me to go away in various ways. And I think that is incredibly difficult for us to be able to grapple with in spaces like this. But it became it was something that I've had a sense of in being in many, many meetings, but it kind of became very clear here. And I think that what ends up happening, particularly as we've gotten rid of requirements for our, silverback colleagues to have to retire, is that it's our graduate students who are the ones who are the most impacted, and not those who, can stay on till 97 years, right, without publishing at all. So I think that for me, this is it was perhaps a no-duh, but it felt like a moment of clarity and really about the anxiety of the old, right? And I think that there's something that's also different because we have different bodies who are coming in as well. So the scholarship, and we didn't name that, right? The scholarship is not just different, but the folks who are actually representing that scholarship are quite different ourselves. And so we are changing the body, we are changing the complexion of the university, and that is incredibly uncomfortable, right? And I think we're seeing part of it in this continued discourse on the anxiety about the humanities.
No doubt. I didn't mean it that way. I will say, I was telling George this, that I served as president of the African Studies Association. And a year later, Africa as a Country is this great blog website. And the editor there asked me to write something reflecting back on my presidential lecture, etc. And I wrote a piece called Academic Reparation and the Case for Stepping Aside.
I need to read that.
And the flack I got from some of my colleagues of a similar age or older, was unbelievable. That's just, I'm putting that out there just because. I wanted to talk a little about what I'm taking away, which is a different tension than I came here with, I think, which is about scale. So I was, I think about George's talk and Relina's, both of which were about creating a space where small victories were happening. They felt like, and they were made without a lot of institutional support, community support, and they just seemed so lovely and protected because they weren't beholden to anybody. Yours is a little more vulnerable. But I was heartened by that. And then, I don't know if Chris is still here somewhere. But it's really late there. It is, that's true, especially if you're not well. And I was just like overwhelmed by the idea that change will happen because we're going to convince the NEH to double the amount of funding that goes to humanities research and how that's then going to create this and this. And it's true, but it won't happen. And or at least it won't happen in my lifetime, and it doesn't tell me like what to do. And so I come to things like this because I want to know like what to do. And there's something about the smaller stories, the scale, and maybe we need to think about them at the same time, a sort of a multi-pronged approach that you need to be able to think sort of at that national or even global level, but you need to also create these spaces where you win and you have autonomy and the ability to build out what you want. And those places are not easy to find and to do. But they really matter. I think they also matter for like mental health and for feeling like you're not always under assault. So that's what I'm sort of grappling with, these wonderful stories of, I don't know, beautiful educational, collaborative, public, whatever you want to call it. And then also the magnitude of what we're dealing with, and yeah.
So, I mean, these remarks were great. I suppose in spite of having referred to the crisis of the humanities, or used the phrase in my talk, I actually
actually not a pessimist about the humanities. I think the humanities are actually in phenomenal shape. I think they're in phenomenal shape because the research I read nowadays is amazing stuff. And because the people I know who do the humanities are incredible people. And that applies also to the experience of today. I thought today was a really, really great day. Let me just say, I want to say a word about the life cycle of fields, and then about the duty of universities to preserve them, sort of abstract thoughts. When the University of Chicago was founded, it divided the possible disciplines that one might study in the entirety of human existence into physical sciences, biological sciences, humanities, social sciences, and Near Eastern studies. Right? The Oriental Institute is one of the governing bodies of the University of Chicago, and that has something to do with the whimsy of John Rockefeller. But it does mean that I think we have something close to the largest Near Eastern studies department on earth. When the University of Chicago had its last big commission on graduate education in 1980-81, it was the Baker Commission. It was Keith Baker, in fact, was so despaired about the unwillingness of his colleagues to take up any of the recommendations of this long report that he promptly left and went to the West Coast. But in part it was generated by just plummeting, I mean, I have the numbers here, of course, the absolute plummeting enrollments in the social sciences and physical sciences, chemistry, physics, all of those. All the ones, exactly the physical sciences and STEM sciences, which are now doing extremely well, their enrollments were just plummeting in the 1970s. And this generated anxiety, so they had a report on graduate education. All of which is to say, things go up and things go down. I'm allowed to say that because I'm an historian. And let me just follow on that by saying, I don't know, something like, I think I really love universities. I love universities for what they do. I love universities because they produce and critique and preserve knowledge. And that means also preserving, critiquing, and sustaining fields of inquiry. And as I think what we all understand, I mean, I think one of the, I don't know, it just doesn't follow exactly on anything that was said. I think one of the reasons we need to preserve fields and doctoral education in fields, I suppose it follows on the question, should we eliminate fields if there are no jobs? One of the reasons we need to preserve them, because if you are allowed, somebody mentioned Acadian earlier, if you were to allow doctoral education in Acadian to go away, the reconstitution of Acadian studies would become nearly impossible. And actually, in spite of the fact that the job market is bad, and certainly when I applied to graduate school, people said, oh, there are not going to be any jobs. And it was kind of true when I came out. There weren't very many jobs in my field. The simple fact of the matter is that we should preserve Acadian because there are people who want to study it. They should be allowed the opportunity to get a higher degree in whatever they want to study. That's why we have universities. That's one of their public goods.
Great. Thank you to each of you. Let me now turn things over to the broader group if there are questions from the audience. Amanda?
This is just sort of a comment. I mean, I kind of want to go back to Elias's question in the early session about, is the extent to which anxiety about or concern about the job market is playing I just want to say I mean, it's crucial, but playing an outsized role, perhaps in some of the ways in which the conversation has developed over the course of the day. So I want to say myself that I don't think that the problem of the job market is the problem of certain fields, and specifically, let's just say more traditional humanities fields or ones that have been around longer. I don't think that the problem of the job market is that they are rightfully obsolete now. I feel that plays right into the very problem that Chris Newfield was diagnosing. And I think that it's wrong to imagine that to idealize job success in certain fields right now. Because actually, I think a large reason why there's job success in certain fields right now, it's multiply determined. Part of what's going on is an absolutely crucial demographic correction being made by the university. It's not because the university is saying, oh, let's only hire people doing community engaged work. That is not the reason these hires are taking place. It is in some instances, it can be locally within a context where there is the capacity to hire and the value commitment linked to community work, so then that happens, like I'm gonna guess with, the students you were talking about. But I don't think that I worry about trying to sort of somehow feel like you can solve the economic problem and the larger intellectual sociological problem of the job market by saying these fields are doing it right. These people are at the right end of the university, at the right end of the wedge, and everybody else is misguided and obsolete. Because I think it's also absolutely crucial. I'm sorry, I'm going on a little bit here, but I am the director of a Humanities Institute, so indulge me. But I also think it's really, really crucial to recognize that so much of these wonderful cross-disciplinary programs that are advocacy-based in the most absolutely crucial ways, advocating for race, gender, disability, et cetera, came out of scholarship in the humanities. I mean, when I was in graduate school in the 80s, I was reading Skip Gates, Houston Baker, and Hortense Spillers. I mean, just, and Eve Sedgwick and Judith Butler. And that was completely transforming the field. And the field, remains transformed. I mean, Ella may be maybe Anglophone, 19th century, 20th, but she's doing post-colonial, really important transnational work that's developed over time in a changing discipline. So I get a little worried about, I just don't think that the humanities should eat its own. I'm not keen on internal division. I think advocacy-based work is utterly crucial, and that different people have different value commitments, and we need to live with that difference. But I also kind of feel like unity is important.
George, were you?
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to say, and I was thinking about that second issue of courses that you talked about, but I also wanted to respond here, which is, I don't think the two things, the areas that are expanding and the areas that somehow should, are in decline, should be in decline, those things are not necessarily connected in any particular way. Here's what I do know from my field, that from the moment I entered graduate school in the fall of 1981, some humanities professor has always told me there are no jobs in humanities. They discouraged me when I was an undergraduate at Harvard from applying to Ph.D. work because of it. They discouraged me when I went to Stanford from thinking that there were jobs at the other end. They discouraged me at every single thing. And so I do a basic thing with my students. I say, don't listen to them, because they're talking from a very limited framework, and they don't understand all the other things that create jobs. The most fundamental thing in my field, which is Latino history, is demographic, which has transformed the marketplace, right? Every single UC campus right now is trying to become a Hispanic serving institution, every single one. And that means every single one is going to hire 25 people in the larger area of Latino studies over the next number of years, because they all want to be Hispanic serving institutions. Now, that's California, but that's also because California just passed an ethnic studies requirement K through 12. So every indication I see is only growth in my specific area. But that's only one of many areas. I would also say it's probably growth in Latin America writ large. I'd say there's also growth in Asia, whatever the field is. That's both languages and history. I say history departments change the way you look at the world in terms of how many people you should have in Latin America and Asian history versus European history. That's going to change. That's basic. That's the basic demographics of the United States. And history departments by themselves have to make that transformation, all right? So I say that because then the question is, how do you build a field, or how do you build new fields? One of the commitments I made when I entered my first job was I was going to teach Latino historiography every other year through my entire career, no matter where I was. And if I couldn't do it, I wouldn't be at that place. Luckily, I started at UCLA, then I went to Michigan, and then the fear in going to USC that I wasn't going to be able to maintain that, but I did. And even when they asked me to be a dean, the first vice dean for diversity, I said, only if I can teach this course every other year, right? What does that mean? Very simple. It means that every graduate student I recruit, I can tell you will be able to take a comprehensive graduate course in Latino history and historiography while you're here. There's no doubt about it, because I'm not moving from that position. They're going to have to drag me away before I will stop doing that. That consistency, by the way, I found out later on, I was the only person in the country doing that. That Yale got together with Chicago, got together to try to do one that would be nationwide a couple of years ago because they weren't able to pull it off. But that's basic discipline building blocks, right? Is to be able to teach courses in those areas that are growing, in which you're trying to train people into a field.
None of them.
Okay, so what does that look like 30 years later?
8.
It looks like Kelly Lyda Hernandez, Natalia Molina, Monica Munoz Martinez. These are all MacArthur Genius Award winners over the last 3 years,
Come to now.
right? Natalia, who was my graduate student, is now my colleague, right? So part of this is that if you want to build a field, you've got to have certain building blocks, at least in a couple of key places, so that there are graduate students being produced that are well-trained, that can get jobs. And I've got a student at every UC campus. I've got one at Princeton. I've got one at Cal State. I've got them all over the place. But that doesn't come from just like, oh, great graduate students, and no, it comes from a consistency that we rarely see in academia, right? And I just want to say that if you want to build a field, you've got to have a consistency in terms of what you do and how you train students, and you've got to develop, those skills. Because nobody trained me to do it, except that's not really true, because my mentor is Al Gamadillo at Stanford, who trained the first group. And I looked a lot at him to sort of say, how do you, he trained Vicky Ruiz, he trained David Gutierrez, he trained myself, and a whole range of people. So the point is that the scaffolding absolutely has to be there, and there has to be consistency. And by the way, when I went back and looked at African American history, I saw what Duke did. I saw what UCLA did. I saw what certain places did to absolutely build that field. The other thing is you don't do it alone. You do it with colleagues, right? At USC, it's been Bill Devereaux, who's a Western historian who teaches the research seminar, so I teach the reading seminar, right? You do it with other people who agree with the mission of doing this. This is part of our regular faculty commitment. This is not about extra funding. It's not about it. It's literally about saying we're going to be consistent in this, and we're going to do it over a long period of time as an institution. It's really hard to do, but with that consistency, it's needed in most fields to develop in the way they do. It's not magic, but it's the consistent determination to get it done. So I just, I think the scaffolding is really important, and this can be replicated in different fields, in different areas, but you've got to create a community of people committed to doing that, and the networks across the board so that you can do that, right? I've already just signed up to write 2 promotion letters in the field, right? I know there will be at least 3 more. That's regular summer work for me, right? Because I take seriously the fact that I'm now a full professor and I have to write those letters in order to be able to evaluate the next group of people. I mean, there's so many different things that I just want to say can be done in this profession and has been done in humanities areas that are critically important.
One of the things that stands out thinking about the last couple of comments is, I mean, on the one hand, the vital role of multiple kinds of scaffolding, right, to support things. But I was struck the way you were focusing on situations where you're building a field, right, and what it takes to do that. I think, you know, thinking partly of the title of the conference of Transforming the Humanities is not only writ large, but also thinking about what changes and transformations look like within departments that may already, that exist. And I think part of it is maybe shifting from this field versus that field to really be thinking and directing some of our attention at transformations within fields and what those look like in light of our present moment. So I don't know, I mean, maybe that would take us back to some of the curriculum questions. I'm not sure if others want to take that up.
Well, for me, some of the most exciting things about this work over the last almost a decade has been not just rethinking, you know, the substance of a particular field, but the other things that happen in a classroom, and some of the things that were brought out in your presentation, and the ways in which you can transform a field just in terms of the kinds of skills that come along with it, and we haven't. We have to be honest, we've been really bad at that. You know, we're great often with undergraduates. In this course, you will learn how to do this, and you will learn how to do that. We never do that with graduate students, and they're sitting there wondering, what am I learning how to do? What am I learning here? Besides the substance. And so thinking about, you know, creating collaborative kinds of work, co-authorship, stuff that was just like, what? You can write with another person. I mean, years ago, I was asked to chair this committee to define the dissertation across the entire university. And it was amazing. It was such an eye-opener because the mathematicians were like, well, it's about 30 pages. And then the scientists were like, well, I have some co-authored articles and I staple them together and that's my dissertation, which means the same chapter can be in more than one dissertation. Oh my God. But thinking in those ways about a field. So I think fields that don't do that kind of work and continue to operate in sort of early 20th century, but not 19th century ways of teaching, that maybe they need to go. But if we are actually moving forward and changing the ways we're doing this, and we're thinking carefully about writing for multiple audiences, public speaking, what these sorts of things that I never had any access to, not to mention we hardly give any support for teaching. It's improving, but not very much. Then I think that fields they'll thrive in the humanities. So it's not just about the stuff, it's about the stuff.
And I think that's what our students want. So in terms of the co-authorship model, I bring in a lot of students who are first generation like I was. And the thought of writing, and right now I'm trying to get my students to have 2 articles that are out and then 1 in the pipeline by the time they go in the job market. And we're very clear about that, and it seems really intimidating. But what we have is I have a group with my advisees. I know we've been dissing the sciences, but looking at the lab model, we have a communication and difference research group, which is my advisees, my colleague Carmen Gonzalez, who does another area of communication, my colleague Leilani Nishime, we're bringing in another Black Studies scholar. And we all meet together and share and present ideas, and it provides the opportunities for students to do co-authorship with each other, to work on a project first and then figure out what does co-authorship look like. So, I mean, I think this really addresses for me, especially the students that have a side eye, right, towards the academy sometimes, and they're thinking, well, but this is a way that I can bring in other voices, I can bring in critique, we can present together in very substantive ways. And this wasn't at all how I was trained. It wasn't until I became a full professor that I started doing this, and I just wrote a book that was co-authored with a psychologist. Entirely different ways of thinking, but that for us made sense. So I think that kind of a transformation, it feels like it solves a lot of problems that we have articulated here.
Yeah, I'll say just something about change internal to the program in a second. What I was thinking about Amanda's remark about the job market and what its impact is reminded me that, you know, in my life as chair of the department and therefore in my work trying to make a little tiny community of people get along. And I suppose, in fact, leading up to the work on the Graduate Education Committee at Chicago, I suppose the impact of the bad job market that impinges on my daily life most regularly is that, and this is an interpretation, I don't know that this is so, that it's the precariousness of the job market is part of what's made graduate education into, or graduate student status, into something like an identity and not a stage in one's training. Because if it's just a stage before a launching point for a career, I mean, and the reason I say, and you know, and that a graduate student self-identify as a graduate student as if it were a kind of ontological condition is part of what then produces, you know, so far as I can tell, a great deal of the tension, some of which expresses itself in their highly localized community between students and department, but also then between students and the university. Should they be unionized? Are they getting this and that and the other thing? And in any event, I worry, I think that if there's a crisis in graduate education that I face something like, you know, every week, it has to do with what I see as the influence of this other problem on something like micro-scale human and pedagogical relations. About changes in the department, I mean, I suppose, responding more closely to Tal, I suppose, you know, one of the things that, I'll return to the word attrition, if only because it continues to puzzle me, but I'll try to bring it back to what you say, that I don't know why we accept attrition in graduate school at the level we do. It doesn't, you know, a successful university gives a BA to what, 94%? That's the Ivy plus, 94% of the people graduate with their BA. It's, I think, higher in law school. It's higher in the business school. So what are we doing that we have this astonishing rate of attrition, often, you know, 20 to 30% in graduate school? Are we doing a really astonishingly terrible job of admitting people? Are we doing an amazingly terrible job of teaching them? And I think, I'll say two things. They're very simple fixes, but two things that have really inflected my thinking about how my department should work. One is a report that came out of Yale about how to help and mentor students at the moment that they end coursework, which I thought was a fantastic document and certainly provoked a lot of thinking at Chicago among the select departments to which we circulated it. And it's related, I suppose, to a talk that I had with my brother, whose department won some big prize for its success in pedagogy, which is that, as my brother described it to me, you know, there was an older form of math teaching in which they surveyed these 27,000 people in calculus. And the job of the math professor was to survey the unsorted mass of humanity and locate the math genius in the room and teach that person. And everyone else should please go away or learn enough of the whatever to do their engineering degree. But your job was to identify the math genius. And beyond just mentoring people, it's, you know, at these transformational stages in academic work, when you move from coursework, you're essentially reading a reading list plunked down onto the desk unceremoniously. Beyond helping people with the transition to a different stage of autonomy in the determination of their direction in the program. I suppose also, you know, one of the things that we try to get people to do is make sure that you teach all the students. And I think that's assisting with attrition. I mean, that's a simple formulation for a complicated problem of personalities, but I think inviting colleagues to make sure that you teach all the students has actually been a kind of helpful admonition in reducing attrition in my program.
Great, thank you. So questions from the audience? Oh, maybe we'll do that one first and then
First of all, I wanted to say thank you to everyone, not just the panelists, but everyone who spoke today. I've learned so much I've heard so many inspiring things, a lot of them on the macro level, and that's really useful to hear about. But in the roundtable discussion now, I'm hearing a lot of things that are more at the level that I'm comfortable with, namely the micro level to do with the classroom, the graduate classroom. Kate Lofton mentioned this in the Yale study, that that was one area of pretty much general discontent among the graduate students. And I say to myself now, I think I have a much better sense of what good pedagogy looks like in an undergraduate seminar than I do when it comes to a graduate seminar. And that, I think, is because we so rarely have conversations about what good graduate pedagogy looks like. I don't think that's an accident. I think most of my faculty colleagues connect to graduate seminars in a different way than their relationship to the undergraduate seminar. I think it is a crucible for pure narcissistic self-replication, right? But it's not going to ever become anything other than that if we don't start to have conversations about that. I think even at Brown, where I think we do a great job talking about teaching, we often leave out graduate teaching. I think most of my colleagues are much more amenable to taking advice about teaching, having the teaching recorded and discussed when it comes to the undergrads, but not in the graduate seminars. And I don't know how that's going to change. Many of you gave me really great ideas about what I could do to be a better teacher in my graduate seminars: community engagement, radical listening, questions about canonicity. Those are all great. If you had more suggestions, I would love to hear more. I mean, there are graduate students that I think should also weigh in more on what they think a good graduate teacher would look like.
Say something similar to Zachary, in the sense that I feel like the conversation has been moving up and down across different levels. There's been a scale issue, and there's been some slippage between those different levels. So on the one hand, we seem to occasionally be talking about the 21st-Century Humanities Ph.D. across the country and maybe across the world and the state of the humanities. And then we're occasionally talking more strategically about how individual programs and even individual faculty members and even students can sort of figure out how to navigate the ruins of the system to their own advantage. And so how do you construct a program, as George was just saying, like how do you succeed in this current landscape? You do it with these things. And so, yeah, just looking ahead, because I gather there's going to be other events in the series, right? So it might be interesting to think about where we're positioning what is the object of analysis? Is it the humanities sort of writ large? And I share Zachary's feeling that it's hard to think that way about what any of us can do, or is it more how can a DGS in a given program do a better job at positioning his or her students for the market such as it is? Yeah, so.
To throw another object of analysis onto the pile, we've been circling around the issue of we've been talking a lot about educating of students, but we've been circling around the issue of the educating of our colleagues, of faculty, and I would love to hear some thoughts about how faculty are inculcated, enlisted and educated in this process, because in my experience, that's actually the most difficult part of this overall.
Great. And maybe we'll turn back to the panel now.
I just want to advocate for transparency, both in terms of with our colleagues, but also with our graduate students. I teach a lot of first-generation students who are graduate students, and the one thing they always say is there's all these unwritten rules, no one tells you what they are, and so part of my graduate teaching, but also my approach to my colleagues, is to be as transparent as possible in terms of what is being expected, what's coming up next in terms of challenges. One of the things I do actually in my graduate teaching is because I do a book series, because I work with a lot of young scholars, I end up seeing a lot of new manuscripts, the books that just came out, awards, so I teach into that. I always teach books that have just come out the last 2 or 3 years, as opposed to classics. Other people are really good at teaching the classics. I'm really good at saying, this book is gonna, just won this award, it's gonna turn the field around and that kind of stuff, because that's what I enter. But that means, by the way, that I'm often assigning books that I want to read, that I haven't read yet, that I want to read. And therefore, the transparency there is I'm as excited as you are in terms of reading it. And I'm going to participate in the discussion. So I have students run the discussion, and I am a participant. Try to keep my mouth closed as much as possible so other people have a chance to speak. That transparency, my graduate students say, is refreshing to them because they understand what I'm doing and why I'm teaching, how I'm teaching. And it helps them think about new works in a very different way. And I just think that across the board, we are not as transparent in what we're teaching and why we're teaching as we should be. And I think that's the same with our colleagues in terms of sharing our approaches for why we do what we do.
Yes, Jean, thank you.
I actually wanted Katie to talk, specifically when it's about like the winning of hearts and minds. So you noted this moment where the graduate school sort of kind of basically says to departments, you can do this however you want to do it. These are our minimal. We had the same situation. Basically, however many credit hours you want to, however many years, whatever, we'll give you this much funding, but you can structure it however you want. And almost nobody bit. So I wondered what that next step looked like at Yale, where departments actually bought into reimagining.
Well, we threatened to cut the program size.
Okay.
So that total program size model is the carrot and the stick for better and for worse.
Okay.
And we said that any cuts from existing programs would go into these new programs so that our overall program of the humanities would stay the same. And there are programs, as we know, that could employ a lot of students right now in the market. We don't necessarily always have built up faculty infrastructure in that. But threats is always, unfortunately, the way to animate, and threats around loss of these numbers. But I think the question about teaching is the question that, for me, is the driving question. And for me, that orients both the undergraduate and graduate classroom. I want to speak in favor as we close to why we don't talk about graduate teaching. It's because the vast majority of our colleagues don't teach graduate students. The vast majority of students I've placed in jobs are not teaching graduate programs. So I'm pleased that we're doing okay sometimes in undergraduate teaching, since that is the vast majority of available employment for people with PhDs, not only in the humanities but beyond. I think humanists are extremely anxious. They're both profoundly obnoxious about their own knowledge and very anxious about what it is to ruin the magic of their incantatory greatness. What would it be to parse that out into pieces? To say it's not that you're excellent, you did the following 7 strategies. What would it be to take the 7 great scholars, whatever field, of the last 10 years that we could all agree on, and really anatomize their careers into questions of politics, of location, of particular journals whose editors had affinity because what if we really worked that all out? It would be both, perhaps for some people, a heartbreak, but as a person who came from a world that did not have the universities and imaginary, that's what I think George means about being transparent, is he's a strategist with his students about how to manage the material infrastructure of the mysteries of higher ed, whose mystification makes us charge $82,000 a year for this education that you can get with a library card and some good conversation around a table. So that difference means a lot to me, and I am deeply remunerated by that imaginative monetization of a very basic practice. But we need to be, I think, especially with our graduate students, allies and compatriots. And I'm interested in what you said, Cliff, about identity. I'm kind of playing that thought around in my head. I think a lot now, and I'll just close with this, that when I teach graduate courses, I always co-write the syllabus. It takes so long. But the students who are going to be in the class, we correspond for the month prior and co-create a syllabus that includes 4 days that are my days, where I kind of design in my fantasy scenario, and then they get the other 9 days to organize around materials they think are cool or things they saw, whatever, in their mediated world, and then skills that they want to have. This has made, just like reading new books, me a radical learner in those classes and spaces where I'm talking about things I don't know anything about. But that also allows me to assess them as teachers and to be more aggressive when they failed in their pedagogy of me, so that the graduate seminar is both, let's learn this field, mine happens to be US religious history, but also how are you as a teacher of me who is still gaining ground in territories that I'm far away from. But again, that's work, that's time, and it really decenters my authority in ways that frankly makes grading more complicated, it makes assessment more difficult, and it highlights instead the value of interpretation and communication of interpretation, which I don't pretend to as yet be an expert in.
I can give an example for Zachary also that uses some pieces of this. One of the things that I've been really attentive to is that graduate students also have tremendous gaps in knowledge that I think can be pretty basic. So this is almost the opposite of what George was saying. So I did this one model. My favorite class is Black Cultural Studies. I'm going to start asking to teach it every other year now that I heard that I can do that. But what I would do is I teach an undergraduate, and for years I taught an undergraduate version and a graduate version, right? And graduate was a seminar, and I tried to do funky things, but it was still, wait a second, there were gaps there. And also, my graduate students in our system would eventually teach that class as an instructor of record to undergraduates, and they wanted to see me doing it. So what I started doing was I hate like 3 to 4 hour seminars, so we never did that. I would instead have them come to my undergraduate 40-person, which is a small class at the University of Washington. I have also taught 750 people classes. But so in this class, they would come and stay, and they would participate in different ways, and then we would go straight to the seminar space, and I'd be like, okay, so what did you all think? And they'd be like, that student said that thing, that was so off the wall. Oh, can you believe that happened? Or, ooh, and I'd say, well, okay, now tell me, be really honest here. What gaps do you have? What did I miss? How was I? And they would push on that. And it was this really important space of them thinking through their own pedagogy as well, and then a really easy transition into a deeper dive. So the undergraduates would read a chapter, they'd read the book, right, into a deeper dive of the work. But that combination, that they also felt really hungry to actually be in a lecture space and be like, I don't know Black Cultural Studies, I don't know Stuart Hall, I don't know Paul Gilroy, and so that they could kind of get that piece and then have us kind of work through it together in various ways. So that was really cool, and I started doing it because with my administrative work, I couldn't teach as much, so I was like, oh, this is a kind of a 2-for-1. Then it became a whole other thing pedagogically.
Great. So thank you very much to each of our speakers. I think we spent some time thinking about the subtitle of this, of critique and transformation. And I think one of the things that continues to resonate with me is this question about scales and levels and a sense of the transformation or multiple transformations. And I look forward to both sitting and thinking with many of the comments from today as well as future conversations on these multiple scales. So let me conclude with just a word of thanks to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.